The hamster, a ubiquitous pet that is known for being cheap, cute, and low maintenance. All across North America, one can find hamsters in almost every pet store that sells live animals. Yet the hamsters that we see almost everywhere have a far stranger backstory than you may expect. You see, the hamsters that you are probably most familiar with their golden, glossy coat of fur, come from Syria, and until the 1930s, not a ton was known about these animals. In fact, outside of Syria, few people had ever been exposed to these creatures. Even in Syria, the hamster was not a particularly common sight. Yet now, the hamster is well known across the Western world. How did this happen? Well, it's a bizarre story of a niche scientific expedition leading to the full-scale domestication of this once rare species. So without further ado, let's dive into the origins of how the Syrian hamster became one of the most popular pets in the world. But first, I want to explain the reason for the hamster's initial obscurity. Why were there so few mentions of the golden hamster prior to its famous capture in the 1930s? Well, this mostly has to do with its lifestyle. Syrian hamsters are nocturnal, meaning that they sleep during the day and are active during the night. And to anyone that's ever owned a hamster and is familiar with the incessant hum of a hamster spinning its wheel in the night, I'm sure this won't come as any surprise. But anyways, they're also burrowing animals. So in the wild, they can burrow really, really deep. It's how they defend themselves from predators. In fact, the nest of hamsters that would be finally captured in the 1930s would be found 8 feet underground. Which also means that if you own a hamster, you really gotta put a lot of bedding in that cage. They love to dig underground. But anyway, what this really does mean, what the significance is that unless someone was looking specifically to track down a hamster, and why would you want to do that? Well, you wouldn't really encounter them. And while their existence was well known to Syrians, and even the Europeans, actually the first publication that briefly described Syrian hamsters came from 1797 in Alexander Russell's Natural History of Aleppo. Yet, there was simply a general lack of interest in the species. But regardless, there are a few interesting details about the Western world's early encounter with the Syrian hamsters. For example, the original descriptions of hamsters in the 1797 book described them as European hamsters. Essentially, they got the two species confused. You know, there are separate hamster species from different areas, and a European hamster is roughly 3 times the size of a Syrian hamster. So they're very different. Actually, they're now critically endangered. But regardless, the author, while he did briefly mention Syrian hamsters, he did not, in fact, know very much about the species, as this error clearly signifies. Otherwise, in 1839, at a conference, a zoology conference, the golden hamster, or Syrian hamster, his names are synonymous, was finally, at least in Europe, recognized as its own distinct species. And there actually was a hamster on display. So someone had brought a hamster from Syria specifically for the purpose of this conference. So there was very minor interest in this, just from a sheer zoology documentation purpose. But no one had seen the hamster as a useful species. So there wasn't any wide-scale breeding yet. They weren't kept as pets. They weren't used as lab animals. There were simply just a couple of reports published on these animals. This all changed in 1930 when a zoology professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I'm sure I'm going to pronounce this horribly wrong, but his name was Israel Arhoni, decided that he needed to procure a litter of these golden hamsters. And the reason why is actually rather familiar to anyone who has heard about the challenges of breeding pandas in captivity. You see, Arahoni had a colleague at his university named Saul Alder, and Alder was trying to study a nasty disease called leishmaniasis. And he was doing this by experimenting on Chinese hamsters, which were known to be excellent animal models for this disease, as when you experiment on them, they can somewhat mimic the symptoms of this disease, the symptoms that occur in humans anyway. Yet, he found that these animals were impossible to breed, just like the pandas, right? and they just wouldn't do it. So he decided that his dependence on these Chinese imports it was just untenable. He kept on having to bring them in. They're hard to track down. Again, like, no one was really breeding these things, and they're hard to find. So he decided to entrust Israel with the task of locating and capturing some of these Syrian hamsters, and so he could have his own litter of hamsters for these experiments. He definitely chose the right man for the job, though. Israel had great familiarity with most of the animal species in the region. He had even helped the last Ottoman Sultan find butterflies for his massive butterfly collection. So he was well equipped with a network of contacts throughout the Middle East from his early travels, and he used this network to track down the elusive Syrian hamster. So when he arrived in Aleppo, he instructed his local guide, and again, I apologize wholeheartedly for this awful pronunciation, but the guy's name was Georgius Kahil Tahan, to help him to get to a certain farm whose location has been lost to us. But it is a farm that he was quite familiar with at the time. He'd been here before. And he used a guide to help him communicate with the local leader to organize a search for some hamsters. And that they did. Apparently, our Honi hired several local laborers, and it took him many hours of backbreaking work digging large holes into fields. Apparently, they upended many stalks of grain to try to find this hamster. But after several hours, they found a nest 8 feet underground. And this nest contained 1 female and 11 young. The young being so fresh that they still had their eyes closed, indicating that they were probably only a week or 2 old. Now, the next part of the story is by far the most famous. You see, it's quite common practice amongst rodents to kill their young in times of stress. I know it sounds brutal, but most rodent species have huge litters of babies, and in times of food scarcity, it might be prudent to lessen the litter so those that remain have a feasible chance of surviving to adulthood. They also tend to do this when they're stressed due to human intervention, which, that's a case when their instinct probably works against them. But it is what happens. It happens with mice, it happens with rats, and it does happen with Syrian hamsters. So what happened here is that the mother killed one of her young. And upon seeing the mother hamster sever the throat of one of her pups, Georgius put her in a jar of cyanide to prevent her from killing any more of her babies. Yet Arhoni had a rather romantic or poetic interpretation of the mother hamster's savage act, and a quote from his memoirs that, "When I saw the hamster harden her heart and sever with ugly cruelty the head of the pup that approached her most closely, natural motherly love led her to kill her dear child. It is better that my infant die, that it be the object of an experiment performed on it by a member of the accursed human race." Poetic sentiment for what is a rather typical rodent instinct, but in any case, I think it is rather interesting how the zoologist, right, a man who was so familiar with the nature of animals, interpreted this act as a loving one rather than what the guide saw, which he was apparently rather disgusted, rather repulsed by the act, thinking the mother to be ill. But in any case, these hamsters made their way back to Jerusalem with Aharoni, and Alder ended up entrusting his colleague to breed them so he could study them. Yet these hamsters were improperly stored, and as any Syrian hamster owner could probably attest, they are escape artists at the core. Like, they will find any possible way to escape their enclosure if they don't like it. And if you let them run around the house, you're gonna struggle to find them. You'll find them hiding behind some fixture that you never expect, I guarantee it. So of the 11 hamsters originally captured, Arahoni ended up being down to a mere 4, after 5 made a dramatic getaway during the night and one other died in circumstances we don't know. I mean, young rodents after all, who knows. So he goes down to 4, 3 of them male and 1 of them female. And of these 4 hamsters, he would quickly breed his first hamster colony. Within a year, he reportedly numbered at a whopping 150 specimens. Now, of course, that's a huge number, although they were all genetically quite similar because they all came from siblings, right? Actually, these hamsters are essentially the ancestors of all commercial hamsters. So all hamsters are somewhat inbred that you can buy at the pet store. And because they were inbred, Alder believed that this colony was actually quite vulnerable. I mean, one deadly disease ripping through them could probably wipe out all of her hard work, and he had no intention of going to Syria again to find more hamsters. So Alder began to ship out these hamsters all over the world to build new colonies, so they would have hamsters to do lab experiments on. And by 1931, a mere year after Alderhony had journeyed to Aleppo, the first hamsters arrived in the UK. By 1938, the first hamsters arrived in America. All descendants of the original 4, and all because Alderhony took that trip. And yeah, that's the story of how hamsters began to be bred in captivity. And while the results of this adventure to Aleppo was quite obvious, hamsters are now a lot more than just laboratory animals. They're treasured parts of many people's lives. They're often the first pets that many people have. And yeah, it's all down to Alder, who wanted to study a deadly disease and believed that they were a better alternative to Chinese hamsters that just wouldn't breed. In any case, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Bye for now.